Google Authenticator is a application that will allow your Linux system to enable two-factor authentication. Those two factors could be either a password and a verification code, or it could be a public key and a verification code. To set up multi-factor, we're going to use PAM modules, which are pluggable authentication modules, which are already in Linux. And we're going to install the Google Authenticator, which will allow us to enable the two-factor authentication. If you're running on a Fedora-based system like Red Hat, Alma, or Rocky, you need to install these two packages with this command. If you're running on a Debian-based system, Ubuntu, or Linux Mint, you need to install these packages. They both do the same thing. This is the Google Authenticator. The QR encode is the little part that allows you to see the image that you can scan. If you don't need to scan the images, you don't have to load that package. So we're going to install these files here, and I'm going to install these on an AlmaLinux system. This is an 8.5 beta. It says it's going to install these two files. Say it yes. All right, and both of those files are installed. Now, if we go back to our instructions here, it tells you how to configure SSH to prompt for the one-time password code. We're going to modify the etc pam.d SSHD config file, and the line that you have to put in is auth required PAM Google Authenticator null OK. If the account is not set up for two-factor, the null OK at the end will not prompt for the two-factor password. We're going to modify the SSHD config file, and we're going to add this single line to it. We're adding the options to use a custom secret file, and I'll tell you why in just a moment when we get down to the other portion here. The actual command is the same on Fedora or a Debian-based system. So we're going to take this, copy it, and we're going to go to, no, it's etcpam.d. And I normally put it underneath the password auth. So the second line here. So all I did was paste in that line. The required means it's going to look for the .google_authenticator file. If it finds it, it's going to try to prompt you for the two-factor authentication. Now, since this is just a PAM module, you don't have to restart anything. You just have to make sure you save the changes. We also have to go into the SSH config. You want to search for challenge with a capital C. All right, challenge response authentication. That is what allows your two-factor to respond. Well, that's what allows SSH to prompt you for the two-factor password. If I can get it in here. So we're going to set that to yes. And since you're modifying PAM and SSH, you want to make sure that you have a console to the system you're modifying in case you break something. So I'm going to restart SSH here. And it's restarted. So I'm going to test this with 2 users. Oh, I'm already in it. So I'm going to SSH to it as my first user. It prompts me for my normal Unix password. And it logs me in. Same thing with my second user. It just logs me in. So that's where the null OK comes in. Since it does not find this .google-authenticator file in my home.ssh directory, it doesn't prompt me for the two-factor authentication. Now to set up the two-factor authentication, the command is google-authenticator. And that was installed as a part of that that first installation that we did with the dpackage command. If I do a help right here, you can see there's a bunch of options here. If you don't put the options on the command line, it's going to prompt you for most of them. The ones that I had to look at was the -Q for the type of image that it will display for the QR code. I had to play around with it. The ANSI was too large. Whatever the default was too small. The only one that seemed to print out a decent sized image was the UTF-8. The other option that I'm going to use is the -S for the secret file. On Fedora-based systems, Red Hat, Alma, Rocky, anything based on Fedora, they have SE-Linux installed. And SE-Linux would not allow me to put the actual file, which file is that? It wouldn't let me put the .google_authenticator file in just any directory. It wants it in a certain directory. Something to do with the way SE-Linux labels the files. I did a little Google search and I found out that you could put the .google_authenticator file in the .ssh folder and it would work correctly. I didn't want to take the time to figure out how to make SE-Linux work correctly. So where are we here? So here's the command that we're going to run. We're going to run the Google Authenticator. We're going to tell it it's time-based. Use this when it generates the image, the QR code, so that I can see it on the screen. And we're giving it a custom directory to put our file in, and the name of that file is .google_authenticator. So I'm going to run that on the client. When you copy in this command, make sure that the .ssh directory already exists. So I'm going to hit enter. And it gives me a code there. Delete this. I'm going to open my Android two-factor program, Android OTP, it says. I'm going to scan the image that's there. It's got a code there, 1597. It accepted that code and it wants to update the file. I'll hit yes. Asking me some questions. Disallow multiple uses, yes. Time skew, yes, sounds good. Rate limiting, yes, sounds good. And it's done. So if I go into my .ssh folder, there's a file there. And notice that the file is read-only, and it's read-only by the user. So what you want to do is make yourself a backup of this file, because it's got your private key and it's got your recovery keys here. Now, if you have an application that does not allow you to scan codes, you can you can take this private key, which is the first line here, and you can manually put that in and it will accept it. So now that this user has configured the two-factor, we're going to log out. So when this user goes and logs back in, prompts for their password, and then it asks for the verification code, which is the code that is on the app. 425. And then I'm logged in. Now we have our other user down here that is not set up for two-factor. He just logs in normally. It asks for a password, doesn't find the two-factor file there, so it doesn't prompt for a verification code. So that's very simple. You're running passwords and you log in. So just one more time. PS. Now you also have the option to have public key authentication enabled, but you have to make sure it's enabled. So I'll search for pub key. The default is yes. So, okay, so for the first user, I'm going to copy my public key. Copy my public key for my client to the server. And it's still an SSH command, so it's asking for my verification, my two-factor. Type that in. It says it took it. It says to try logging in. So when I log in there, password and code. Okay, you see there it asks for a password and it asks for a verification code. So that's an extra step there that we got to take out. And the reason it's doing that is because SSH is prompting for the password there. So we need to go back into that PAM module. And that very first line says Substack password off. We want to comment that out so that SSH does not prompt for a password. It only looks at the public key. So I'm going to get out of there. Log back in again. And it just asked me for my verification code. It's about to change, so I'll wait a second here. There we go. Okay, so you've disabled SSH asking for a password and only looking for the public key. But remember, we got a user down here that's not set up for two-factor and is not set up for a public key. So when they try to log in, they will get permission denied. So there are ways to do it where you can mix public key and password, but I'm not looking at that. I'm looking at either having passwords with two-factor or having a public key with two-factor. Now, if you want to lock it down even further, you can modify the SSHD config file. And you can add to it. Nope. You can add the authentication methods, which would say use the public key followed by allowing a prompt for the two-factor authentication. Copy that. And we're going to go to the top and see if it's already there. It is not, so we'll add it to the bottom. Restart SSH. And then we will go back and log in as that user. Prompt for verification code 664-028. And now I'm logged in. So I've logged in as a regular user with public key and the two-factor authentication. The other user that I was working with did not have the public key set up, so they would have to get that set up. Most likely a root user would copy the files over for them. And I'll do it here just to see. Now we've copied the SSH key for the user. But we also need to do the authenticator steps for them. And we're running this as root. So we have to change this to the user's home folder. Now you may have some automated way of doing this, like Chef or what's the other one? Chef or Ansible. You may have some automated way to do that, but I'm just doing it manually, for example. So I would run this command for the user. And it gives you a QR code to copy. Let's see which one it wants. Select yes to all these like I did before. And I will change ownership to Google Authenticator. So now when that user goes to log in, it asks us for a code, and we get logged in. And those were just a few examples on how to set up the Google Authenticator to do two-factor authentication with SSH. Just remember that if you're dealing with a Fedora or Red Hat based system, AlmaLinux and Rocky, SELinux is very particular about where you put the files for the two-factor authentication. You can put them under the .ssh folder. Just make sure the owner is the user and not the root. And make sure the file permissions are 600, which is read-only for the user. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe.